In this video, we are going to check back in on a party that we have already covered in some detail earlier in this series. We saw before how the Radical Party of Chile had evolved out of an upper-class family network in the 1860s, and it started out as a classic liberal party that existed mostly in order to get some of the wealthiest men in Chile elected to Congress. Yet a century later, the Radical Party's National Convention votes to redefine the party as a democratic socialist party. It aligns itself with Chile's socialist and communist parties, and it becomes one of the three main parties in the Unidad Popular alliance that gets Salvador Allende elected to the presidency in 1970. Sober realists on the left often say that no socialist has ever pushed a liberal bourgeois party to the left by working within it. The Radical Party of Chile is among the strongest counterexamples to that claim. The Radical Party never becomes a truly Marxist party like its coalition partners, but it does come to embrace social democracy pretty decisively. And in contrast to the Uruguayan Colorado Party that we covered in the last video, the Chilean Radical Party's shift to the left is led by the party's assembly activists, not its elite leaders. In this video, we are going to examine the first stage of the Radical Party's shift to the left up through the mid-1930s, when it forms its first alliance with the Communist and Socialist parties. The early Radical Party of the Mata and Gallo brothers was a liberal party whose objectives focused on reforming Chile's political system, ending government interference in elections, adopting a proportional representation system and a parliamentary form of government, and weakening the power of the Catholic Church by adopting a system of public education. Economic issues were not a major part of the Radical Party's early agenda, but the early radicals tended to embrace the economic philosophy of 19th century liberalism, including free trade and limited state involvement in the economy. According to the radical congressman and party leader Enrique Maquiber, the Radical Party is founded on individualism, and it was born with the philosophy of Adam Smith. The platform passed by the Radical Party's 1888 convention reflects this economic liberalism. This platform calls for tax cuts, shrinking the size of Chile's civil service, eliminating public holidays, and support for free trade. An earlier draft of the program also called for scaling back public works projects. The platform does include some language about improving the conditions of the workers, but it sees the workers' poor condition as something that can be corrected mostly through education and, of course, through more tax cuts. However, it is important to remember that this 1888 platform reflects the positions of the party's politicians and elite leaders. Many of the rank-and-file activists who filled the local party assemblies are from much less affluent backgrounds, and they tend to have more left-wing views on economic issues compared to the party leadership. Shortly before the 1888 convention, an assembly activist named Abelino Contardo writes that in order to prosper, the Radical Party will have to descend to the people and become something similar to the Social Democratic Party of Germany, which at that time was considered to be the exemplary socialist party that most working-class movements of that era sought to emulate. Contardo is among the radical activists who breaks away from the party in order to form Chile's Democratic Party, but many of the activists who remain active in the Radical Party held similar views. During the decade that follows, these activists appear to get a key ally in the party leadership in the form of the radical politician and intellectual Valentin Letelier. Letelier had served as Chile's ambassador to Germany, and he came to admire the state socialist policies of Otto von Bismarck, which involved establishing a limited welfare state in Germany in the 1880s for the purpose of undercutting the currently outlawed Social Democratic Party. When Letelier returns to Chile, he recommends that the Radical Party embrace a Bismarckian welfare state for the purpose of reducing social unrest. But even von Bismarck's policies are a bridge too far for much of the Radical Party's classically liberal politicians, including most especially Enrique McIber, who has taken over the leadership of the party now that Pedro León Gallo is dead and Manuel Antonio Mata is dying. Letelier's proposals get voted down in the next several party conventions, but he finally prevails in the convention of 1906, which agrees to adopt some very vague language about improving the well-being of workers through state involvement in healthcare and education. McIber is so furious about this that he threatens to leave the party, which likely would have broken the Radical Party apart. McIber is eventually talked down by his co-partisans, but this incident still illustrates just how allergic much of the party's liberal leadership is to even the most moderate reforms. However, men like McIber are about to become a dying breed within the Radical Party. We saw before that the Radical Party had adopted a democratic structure in 1888 that gave the local assemblies a greater role in selecting the party's leadership and politicians. Already by the early 20th century, the assembly activists are making their voice heard in Radical Party politics. A good illustration of this is the shift in the class composition of the Radical Party's delegation in Congress. During the late 19th century, the Radical congressmen were mostly landowners, businessmen, and lawyers from upper-class backgrounds. But over the course of the first few decades of the 20th century, the upper class largely disappears from the party's congressional delegation, and it is replaced by people from middle-class backgrounds, doctors, engineers, and eventually teachers, civil servants, and office employees. This generational change in the party's class composition helps facilitate the Radical Party's shift to the left because it means that progressive and socialist activists working within the party are more likely to find a sympathetic ear among the party leadership by the 1930s. However, the thing that really precipitates the party's shift to the left is the foundation of its youth wing, the Radical Youth, or JR, in 1917. The JR was supposed to be the party organization that young radicals would participate in during their teens and 20s prior to graduating to the main party assemblies in their 30s. But the JR almost immediately becomes a focal point for left-wing politics in Santiago that attracts not only the sons and daughters of Radical Party members, but also small-s socialists and anarchists. The JR leader Armando Labra opens the youth wing's founding Congress in 1917 by repudiating the Radical Party's traditional liberal orientation. He says that the modern Radical Party cannot and should not remain nestled in its individualist creeds. The new spirit that emanates from the party assemblies shall now reforge socialist doctrine into concrete measures towards the liberation of man. It is for this reason that the youth, ever loyal to the noble and ancient red banner, the emblem of the party, proposes to organize an extreme wing of the party, a vanguard, the socialist left of the Radical Party. In any other party, such declarations by a youth wing might be safely ignored by the rest of the party. But the JR ends up being an unusually influential force within the Radical Party. It develops its own parallel party organization, and it soon becomes the best organized segment of the Radical Party. The party leaders do not like how left-wing the JR has become, but they depend on JR activists for organizing their own election campaigns, as the main party assemblies have become increasingly insular during the 1920s. And the Holta Ere ends up with a great deal of influence within the party. It eventually gains representation on the party's executive leadership body, but more importantly, the Holta Ere is also responsible for training, educating, and politicizing the next generation of radical assembly activists. The party's rules state that Holta Ere members must join their local assemblies upon turning 30. And a recurring pattern in the Radical Party thereafter is that party members spend their formative political years in the very left-wing spaces of the Holta Ere, and then they suddenly get dumped into the much more moderate and frankly boring radical assemblies. Many of these activists quickly get disillusioned and they leave the party for good, but others stay in the assembly and they attempt to make their assembly and the party as a whole more similar to the Holta Ere. The man who best exemplifies this younger generation of radical party activists is Santiago Labarca. In the late 1910s, Labarca is a man with many different hats. He leads one of the Holta Ere's largest propaganda centers in Santiago. He is also a wobbly or a member of the industrial workers of the world, and he considers himself to be an anarchist. And then in 1918, Labarca becomes president of the Federation of Students of Chile, which is already by this time a formidable and famously rebellious organization. As I had mentioned in earlier videos, the world in 1918 is in the middle of a major revolutionary wave that was triggered by the Russian Revolution and then by the end of the First World War. There is palpable revolutionary energy in Santiago in 1918, and the Holta Ere and the Fetch are determined to be part of this revolutionary moment. These organizations are soon in constant communication with the Chilean Workers' Federation, or FOCH, which, as you may recall from an earlier video, is led by Recabarren's Socialist Workers' Party. In 1918, the FOCH and the Fetch helped organize a series of anti-government protests called the Hunger Marches. These protests go on for several months, and they are some of the largest and best organized popular demonstrations that Santiago has experienced up until this point. The Holta Ere is by no means the leader of this popular movement, but it does participate actively in these protests, and this leads to a sort of awkward situation with the rest of the party because the government that they are protesting is a government that the Radical Party is a major part of. This is one of the earliest wake-up calls for the party leadership that the Holta Ere is not simply going to fall in line behind what the rest of the party decides. It is its own autonomous organization, and it is quite willing to oppose the party leadership openly when it thinks that the leadership is wrong. Protests are so common in Chile nowadays that it is easy to forget that there were serious life or death stakes to participating in leftist politics in Chile during the 19-teens and early 20s. One of Santiago Labarca's comrades in both the Holta Ere and the IWW is an anarchist poet named José Gómez Rojas. In 1920, the Chilean government launches a crackdown against the Fetch, and Gómez Rojas is among the student activists who is taken into custody. During his time in prison, Gómez Rojas is subjected to torture, and he ultimately dies in the government's custody a few months later, making him one of the early martyrs of the Chilean students' movement. Santiago Labarca is also arrested during this crackdown, but he is far too public a figure for the government to simply kill. The Radical Party Assembly in Santiago not only rallies to his defense, but it also nominates Labarca to Congress in the upcoming legislative election in 1921. Labarca goes on to win his seat in Congress on the Radical Party's slate later that year in what was viewed at the time to be a firm repudiation of the more moderate party leadership by the Radical Party masses. In 1924, Chile's parliamentary republic collapses, and the country enters into a sustained political crisis in which over a dozen separate governments come and go over the next 8 years as the country cycles between military rule and very weak and short-lived civilian governments. This political crisis further weakens the position of the Radical Party elite leadership. To a greater degree than any other party in Chile, the Radical Party leaders attempt to collaborate with the military regimes of the 20s and 30s. And this badly damages the reputation of the Radical Party's leading politicians. By the end of this crisis, the radical assemblies had become less willing to defer to the party leadership, and some of the more left-wing assemblies, like the Assembly of Santiago, spent much of this period in open rebellion against the party leadership. Meanwhile, much of the party's rank-and-file members are now deserting the party for newer leftist parties that are willing to take a much firmer stand against Chile's military dictatorships. In the 1931 convention, the party leadership attempts to lure some of these activists back to the radical fold by supporting a much more left-wing economic platform that includes the expropriation of the means of production and a greater involvement of the Radical Party in union organizing. This 1931 platform also declares the inevitability of class conflict, and it insists that the Radical Party's place is on the side of the wage workers against the dominant class. This 1931 platform is a notable victory for the party's socialist wing, but it is a completely symbolic victory at this point. The party's elite leadership has no intention of following through on any of these things. Later that year, a right-wing radical politician named Juan Esteban Montero is elected president, becoming the first member of the party to hold Chile's presidency. Montero ignores the left-wing parts of his party's 1931 platform, and he even forms an alliance with the Radical Party's historic enemy, the Conservative Party. The party assemblies quickly get so fed up with Montero's government that they successfully pressure the party leadership to withdraw its support from Montero, and the Radical Party enters into the opposition to the first radical-led government in Chile. Montero survives in office for less than a year before he is overthrown in a coup that establishes a short-lived socialist republic in Chile. Several of the Radical Party assemblies are more than happy to see Montero go, and they pledge their full support to the socialist government that has just displaced their own co-partisan from office. Chile's political system finally restabilizes the following year under a liberal-led government in which the Radical Party is a junior partner. However, many of the radical assembly activists are unhappy about their party's participation in this increasingly repressive and anti-labor liberal government. During the course of Chile's long political crisis, many of these assembly activists had formed personal relationships with activists from the Communist Party, and much of the Radical Party's base now sees the Communists as their party's natural ally. In early 1936, the Radical Assembly of Santiago leads a push to break their party away from the liberal government and form an opposition alliance with the Communists. They soon get the Socialist Party on board as well, and this results in the Chilean Popular Front, an alliance between leftist and reformist parties that is modeled on the similar popular fronts in France and Spain that both came to power through elections in 1936. The Chilean Popular Front wins Chile's 1938 presidential election, becoming the third popular front to come to power in a Western democracy during the 1930s. Around this same time, the socialist faction of the Radical Party consolidates its control over the party leadership displacing the party's traditional liberal elite for the first time. The Radical Party's socialist faction has won a major victory for now, but the party's long-term ideological and strategic alignment are hardly settled questions by the early 1940s. The question of whether the Radical Party should side with the left or the right is going to keep popping up in nearly every election throughout the next 3 decades, and the Radical Party is going to find itself mired in a state of almost constant conflict between its socialist and liberal factions as they battle each other for control over the party organization, its ideological orientation, and its destiny.